The Mystery of Coyote Lake. There are thousands of lakes that dot the fields and forests of America, but perhaps none as strange as Coyote Lake. Over the years, visitors to this small lake and its adjacent campsite have reported seeing strange things in the crystal clear waters of this seemingly peaceful reservoir. Now, however, the strange mystery of Coyote Lake might be solved. In 1991, the Sutherland family arrived on a hot Friday afternoon in August. The Sutherlands, Carl, Judy, their 11-year-old twin daughters, Brittany and Bethany, along with their golden retriever, Sammy, were excited to finally begin their week-long summer vacation. Their excitement wouldn't remain for long. The days that followed wouldn't be filled with laughter and fun. They would be filled with fear. The Sutherlands would cut their vacation short, never again to return to Coyote Lake. Camp Coyote, on the shores of Coyote Lake, is surrounded by hills and trees. The camp is located in northern Lower Michigan, not far from the small town of Great Bear Heart. It is a popular destination of vacationers from all over the Midwest who wish to enjoy the peaceful beauty of nature and its splendor. On Saturday morning, after spending their first night at Camp Coyote, the Sutherlands were awakened by Sammy's furious growls. Brittany poked her head from her tent to see the dog standing at the water's edge, hackles raised, growling at something in the water. The dog then raced to a nearby dock and ran down the old wood planks. She stopped at the end of the dock, barking at the calm, smooth waters. Brittany called out to the dog. Sammy glanced only once in her direction, then turned her attention again to the water at the end of the dock. She began whining and pacing. Bethany was awake by now, and she joined her sister by poking her head out the tent flap. The morning air was cool and crisp, and the eastern sky glowed orange. The sun was coming up. From their tent nearby, Mr. Sutherland's voice gruffly ordered one of his daughters to retrieve the dog and make her stop barking. Bethany quickly crawled back into bed and said that since Sammy was Brittany's dog, it was her job to go and get her. Without a word, Brittany climbed out of the tent. She tried calling to Sammy as she walked toward the lake, but the dog hardly noticed her pleas. By now, Brittany sensed that something might be wrong. Sammy was a friendly dog, and she very rarely growled. Brittany hurried out over the dock on bare feet, watching as the dog continued to growl and bark. Suddenly, just before Brittany had reached her dog, it leapt off the dock and belly-flopped into the dark, still waters. Sammy's head bobbed beneath the surface, and the dog dove down, disappearing from view. Horrified, Brittany ran to the end of the dock. Sammy was nowhere to be found. Water churned and boiled the surface, but the dog was gone. Sammy was a good swimmer and even would swim underwater to retrieve a stick if she had to. But this time it was different. Sammy had never dived into the water for no reason at all. Something was wrong, and Brittany knew it. But it was the sight below the dog that caused Brittany to freeze in terror. In the water beneath Sammy was a face. The face of a boy stared up at her from the depths of Coyote Lake. Brittany screamed and screamed, causing her parents to rocket out of their tent and onto the dock. They sprang to where Brittany stood, crippled with fear, staring down into the rippling waters. But the face of the boy had vanished. It had disappeared, leaving Sammy splashing about. Brittany trembled in shock, pointing down into the clear waters. She tried to explain what she'd seen. Brittany said that she'd seen a face, an actual, real face of a boy, about her age, in the water. Taking his daughter seriously, Mr. Sutherland reported the incident to the camp ranger. The ranger's eyes grew wide as Mr. Sutherland related the incredible story. Both men went to the end of the dock to investigate, but nothing out of the ordinary was discovered. Later that day, Bethany asked Brittany if she wanted to go for a swim. The image of the face was still fresh in her mind, however, and Brittany declined. She told her sister that she would stay on the beach and play with Sammy. Bethany, a good swimmer and very unafraid, dove from the dock and plunged head first into the sparkling water. It would be a swim, but she would never forget. The day was hot, and the refreshing coolness of Coyote Lake was pleasant. Beneath the surface, she opened her eyes to see the fuzzy forms of tiny fish darting away from her. She almost laughed out loud, then arched up, breaking the surface of the water. Again, she urged Brittany to join her for a swim. Again, Brittany told her no. Bethany took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and sunk beneath the surface. She scissored sideways, then kicked her legs vigorously, propelling herself downward. She opened her eyes and saw the face. It was the face and body of a young boy, very much alive, staring back at her in the crystal-clear waters of Coyote Lake. It was all she remembered. When she hadn't surfaced after a few moments, Brittany started to worry. But it was Sammy that suddenly plunged into the water. The dog burst from the forest, snarling and growling, and leapt into the water. Knowing that something was wrong, very wrong, Brittany screamed for her father. The Sutherlands, who had been preparing a fire for the evening meal, bolted into the water. Thankfully, Bethany hadn't been in deep water. Mr. Sutherland found his daughter's motionless body and pulled her up. He carried her to the shore, where she coughed and sputtered and regained consciousness. She was going to be okay. Bethany had no recollection of the rescue. The only thing she remembered was the face of the boy staring back at her from the murky depths of Coyote Lake. After explaining to her parents what she saw, Mr. Sutherland waded back into the water and conducted a search. He found nothing. Mr. Sutherland did find it odd, however, that both of his daughters had now claimed to see the same eerie face in the water, but he could find no evidence of anything in the depths of Coyote Lake, let alone a boy. That night, it was Judy and Carl's turn to experience something strange. Thinking that she'd heard a cry for help, Judy woke her husband. They both claimed they heard a small boy crying for help in the lake. Mr. Sutherland hastily retrieved his flashlight and left the tent to investigate. Standing at the edge of the dock, he could hear frantic splashing in the water. Mr. Sutherland called out, but received no answer. He swept the beam of light over the surface of the dark lake until a form suddenly came into view. It was Sammy. In the beam of the light, Sammy was swimming toward the dock. When the dog reached the shore, she shook happily and wagged her tail. Mr. Sutherland could find no explanation as to why the dog would have been swimming so far out into the lake, especially at night. Sammy was fine and showed no signs of undue agitation. Why she had gone swimming so late at night was a mystery. But it was the following night that would forever be burned in the memories of the Sutherland family. It was to be a night filled with horror and fear, and would send the family leaving their campsite, never again to return to Coyote Lake. Sammy was sleeping in the twins' tent at Brittany's feet. Awakened by a noise, the dog suddenly sat up. In the darkness, Brittany crept out of her sleeping bag and drew open the tent flap. The dog leapt outside and stopped abruptly. Her curiosity aroused, Brittany poked her head outside the tent. High above, a full moon lit up the campsite, its reflection glowing blue on the shimmering waters of Coyote Lake. Then, a splashing sound. Brittany could hear faint splashing in the water not far away. Sammy could hear it too, as the dog cocked her head to one side, listening intently. Brittany awoke her sister, and the two girls peered down the beach and toward the lake. Suddenly, in the dim light of the moon, a figure appeared. Bethany called to their parents in the next tent. Mr. Sutherland emerged with a flashlight, aiming it down at the water's edge. What the Sutherlands saw still haunts them to this very day. At the water's edge stood a boy. He was sopping wet, and his skin was a bluish gray. He had no eyes, but rather gaping black cavities. Skin around his cheekbones appeared to be falling off. His clothing was old and tattered and looked as if it would disintegrate at any moment and fall to the sand. The Sutherlands were horrified. Brittany and Bethany held on to one another, trembling in fear. Mr. Sutherland stood frozen, aiming the beam of light at the bizarre figure on the beach. Slowly, very slowly, the figure began to move. The boy raised his arm as if urging the Sutherlands to step forward. However, no one in the family was about to budge 1 inch. Except for Sammy. Without warning, Sammy began to wag her tail. She barked once and immediately began trotting down toward the outstretched arms of the boy near the lake. Terrified, Brittany called after the dog, but Sammy had broken into a full run. When she reached the boy at the water's edge, she barked happily. In the beam of the flashlight, the grotesque figure reached down and patted the dog gently on the head. Sammy wagged her tail happily, sniffing the boy like an old friend. Then a curious thing happened. The boy gave the dog one last pat, turned, and walked back into the lake. Mr. Sutherland kept the beam of light trained on the figure as it entered the water. Within, it was in water up to his head, and in the next instant, he had vanished beneath the surface. The ripples in the lake faded away, and soon the lake was like shimmering glass, reflecting the moon's blue orb. The boy had vanished. The Sutherlands packed their gear that very night and left before daybreak. Never again would they return to camp at Coyote Lake. This, however, is just one of the many sightings of the strange boy that sometimes appears, unannounced, in and around the waters of the lake. A number of campers have reported seeing a small boy, often in the water, often wandering the shores at night. Many campers, terrified by what they'd experienced, have fled in the middle of the night, never to return. Is there really a mysterious boy that haunts the waters of Coyote Lake? And if so, why? Perhaps some history might shed a bit of light on the strange circumstances that had befallen this otherwise peaceful campsite. In the summer of 1922, 12-year-old Albert Martin had gone fishing in Coyote Lake, as he did often throughout the summer. The son of the campsite manager, young Albert lived at the campground all summer, fishing and swimming in the clean waters of Coyote Lake with his dog, Rex. Rex and Albert were inseparable. Wherever Albert went, the dog happily followed. On this particular day, however, Rex did not accompany Albert in the canoe. Albert called and called, but the dog, for whatever reason, hadn't come. Albert set out in his canoe, alone. A sudden storm whipped up over the hills, and the tiny canoe was tossed about. Albert desperately tried to make it to shore, but his craft capsized, tossing him into the water. From the shore, Rex had spotted the disturbance and leapt in the water to save his friend. He was too late. Albert Martin had slipped beneath the waves and drowned. His body was never recovered. Rex was heartbroken and refused to eat or drink. Unable to go on without his lifelong friend, the dog died only a few days later. And to this day, visitors to Coyote Lake still report seeing the strange figure in and around the water. No one has ever been harmed, although many campers have become fearful, choosing to end their vacation short or travel to another campsite. But perhaps there is no reason to worry. Perhaps the mysterious figure really is the ghost of young Albert Martin. Perhaps, in his watery grave, he misses his good friend. And on some nights, he searches in vain to find Rex, to let him know that he's fine. Perhaps a dog, any dog, is a comfort to the boy who sometimes appears at the shores in the crystal-clear waters of Coyote Lake.
If we're out here, then who's in there?